Hello, and welcome to AI Tools Are Gods. My guest today is Cavello, Director of Emerging Technologies at Aspen Digital, where they work at the intersection of AI, law, and the question of who gets to shape the technology that is reshaping everything else. They previously advised Senator Ron Wyden on privacy, internet governance, and algorithmic accountability, and before that led research on fairness and transparency at the Partnership on AI. They are co-organizer of the Public AI Network, a growing coalition making the case that AI should be provisioned like public infrastructure, like electricity, roads, or libraries, rather than left to the logic of private markets. And they have just published a handbook that does something deceptively simple and genuinely important. It traces where the legal definitions of AI actually come from and shows that what happens when you choose one over another. Somewhere in almost every piece of AI legislation in the world, there is a definition of artificial intelligence. That definition determines what the law covers, which systems, which companies, which decisions, which harms. It determines where accountability begins and where it ends. And yet, most of those definitions were not written from scratch. They were borrowed, adapted, combined, or copied almost verbatim from a small number of originals: a US defense bill from 2018, an OSCE recommendation, an EU regulation, often without much scrutiny of the assumptions they carry. As the handbook Defining Technologies of Our Time documents, those definitions were written in specific moments, for specific purposes, responding to specific political pressures. They have since been reused in context their authors never anticipated. The question I want to explore is what it means to govern a technology through definitions that were never quite accurate, that were designed for a different moment, and that are now locked into law. So, B, you have spent years helping policymakers understand what they are actually doing when they write AI definitions into law. And after all of that work, do you think most legislators understand that they are making political choices, not technical ones? And does that distinction matter in practice?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because obviously a lot of our conversations around AI it's a technology, right? And so people are focused on the specific manifestations of the technology, what's counted as in or out, how these systems work and where are the challenges and issues introduced. At the same time, I think that policymakers do recognize that this is a political thing. And I'll say that that is bigger than AI, right? When policymakers are legislating, they're often trying to take a political vision, a view of how the world should be, and then translate that into the technical mechanisms to achieve it. And actually, a brief aside is that I personally think that when we talk about technology, we should call it tech or technology, but technical is actually a bigger umbrella that includes technology, but also law is incredibly technical. Like lawyers, oh my gosh, I learned when I was working in Congress to appreciate why lawyers are like that, why they care where the comma goes. Like it really does matter. So it's a very technical space in that respect. But at the same time, when people are legislating, when people are making policy, they're often actually responding to something very specific, right? There's often a particular incident or a particular actor. The time that so I worked in Senator Wyden's team in the 2021 year as a tech Congress fellow. And during that period of time, even though I was working primarily on kind of privacy and surveillance and AI policy, there was this huge conversation taking place around social media because Frances Haugen had just shared all of this information about what was happening inside of Facebook. And so a lot of policymakers were not motivated by, recommender feeds or algorithmic systems. They were motivated by the fact that the public had was responding to this news, and were really trying to figure out what to do. And a lot of the legislation that was written, a lot of the policies that were crafted, and this is frequently the case, is written with one individual in mind, right? One actor in mind. Like, people are working on scoping these covered entities and what counts as AI and what counts as, but really in their mind they're thinking, how do I get Facebook? And so I think that to that end, um, it is a very political discussion, and there's an extent to which, especially with something as eye-catching and headline grabbing as AI, there can be a reality where policymakers feel like they just have to do something. This thing is happening, I need to do something about it. At the same time, to your point, um, the the way that political decisions are expressed are often buried in this kind of technical, definitional space. And so, I think that, with all that said, definitions in particular as a piece of legislation are an under acknowledged site of these decisions, for two reasons. One, because um, a definition, often written at the top or very bottom of a document, has cascading impacts throughout the entire policy. But also because the reality is, people working in government they're working real hard. They're very busy. They are juggling 10,000 things at once. And so frequently, the way that legislation gets drafted is copy pasting and Frankensteining and smushing a bunch of things together. And definitions are one of the sections of legislation that people will just grab and put somewhere else, perhaps without doing a lot of deep thinking. They like, it worked over here, so we're going to use it over there. And that can have big consequences. And so I think that, while a lot of policymaking around AI and around technology is in fact quite motivated by the political, the way that it shows up is sometimes not as recognized as political. And so that's why my collaborators, Nick Garcia at Public Knowledge, and Eleanor Tersman at the Aspen Institute, and I set out to do this work, was to really like shine a spotlight on how definitions play this really powerful political role.
Yeah, and I fully agree on the use case legislation where you're basically drafting something with a very specific case in your head as a policymaker. Um, I want to dive deeper in what definitions actually do, because your handbook really sets out this argument that definitions are not neutral descriptions, and as you said, they're context dependent choices, and they have huge legal consequences often because they basically shape the rest of the legislation. Um, and in the book, in the handbook, you trace four main lineages: the NDAA definition, the OECD definition, the automated decision system definition from the Algorithmic Accountability Act, and then our very own AI Act, general purpose AI definition for the EU. And you and your co-editors show how each one was written in response to a specific political moment, and as such carries assumptions from that moment forward. I was specifically interested in the ADS, so the Automated Decision System lineage chapter, because you show that that definition is actually technology agnostic. So it captures AI, but it does so within a broader category of systems that make consequential decisions, regardless of the underlying technical mechanism, which is different to the AI Act, for example, in the EU. So that choice that is different from going from a capability focused definition, that has enforcement implication, that shapes how you look at that legislation. So that was a lot of jargon that I've just said, and maybe a lot of people are getting depressed at this stage. So let's try to keep it simple in the question, which is, for someone trying to understand why the choice of definition matters, can you give an example of the single most consequential difference between these lineages that you identify in the handbook, in terms of, for example, who ends up being held accountable?
Yeah, I think when we began this project, defining technologies of our times, we really we talked to a lot of people and we heard from a lot of people. Oh, I'm so glad because here's this definition that I really think should exist, or we all need to get aligned and we all need to be using the same definition of AI. And I understand the motivation there, right? Like there is a very real situation where people end up talking past each other. At the same time, um, I I reject the premise. I really believe that definitions are contextual. And I think a really good illustration of this is perhaps to draw some differences here, the difference between how the NDAA, which is the National Defense Authorization Act, which is fundamentally, it is a big piece of legislation in the United States that basically always gets passed because it funds the military. So people are like, we can't let that not happen. And so a lot of things get hooked onto that bill. And one of the things that that bill does is it sort of directs where further research and further investment will be. And so to that extent, it has this kind of very broad understanding of what these technology systems are. It says that it has this kind of framing of the term that is really about trying to like scope in a lot of possible examples of things. And so when doing a research funding bill, for instance, or when legislating on something that is really about trying to instigate behavior in a certain area, it is sometimes the case that people intentionally try uh, to to scope things in to be more robust against possible changes into the future. And so, one of the ways that different definitions can really have a big consequence on who is held accountable is on whether people are essentially trying to prove that they are included or whether people are trying to prove that they are not included. And so funding versus regulation is like one of the very big spaces where that differentiation takes place. And we can compare this instead to the general purpose AI systems in the EU AI Act and some of the kind of cascading lineages there that even get into some of the very specific terms, like how many flops, how many floating operation actually are involved in building these things, where like there's some very narrow scoping because a lot of people behind the scenes were trying to like prove that they're not part, like don't include me in this. And so I think that for us to understand the role of definitions is for us to understand them as kind of these big kind of conceptual Venn diagrams that we're drawing. And there's a lot of negotiation about where the borders of those shapes fall in terms of who's included and who is not.
Okay, so I think now people are discovering what's behind the sausage factory and how the sausage is made. Yeah, we might not make them very happy or make them anxious on that one. Um, Now, you mentioned in the handbook that a very U.S. thing, which is after Loper Bright, that legislators can no longer defer to agencies to interpret ambiguous language. So first of all, that's something that we're not very familiar with in the EU, obviously. But I think it's very important to see how that change in case law and jurisprudence changes the stakes of getting a definition wrong in the US. And I think that's interesting for us to understand.
Yeah, it's something that is really kind of a challenging shift, although there's still a lot of room for possibility. So, just to clarify the before scenario, before this major Supreme Court case in the U.S. and defining technology of our time primarily focuses on the U.S. AI policy landscape, but obviously pulls from examples in the EU, for example. And one of the things that is very challenging about writing policy about a fast moving topic like AI is that there is this there's this reality that whatever you think whatever you think is real right now might change in a few months, in a few weeks. And so people are aware and sensitive to the fact that if they write something that is extremely specific and concrete, there's a possibility that it might become outdated, perhaps even by the time that the bill goes into effect as a law, right? Like we know, and certainly we experience also, we're still experiencing with the AI Act that there are many stages. Often things have to go through a long procedural process, and in that time, things can go stale essentially. And so, one of the hacks, one of the ways that people work around this is that they create something that sort of gestures at what they want. They say, like, it's kind of like this kind of thing, but we're going to ultimately leave it to the federal agency who's responsible for carrying out this work to do the specifics, right? And to write the particular rules. And that gives the legislators more freedom, and it allows us to pass things into law that maybe would have otherwise gone stale, but instead we can say every 2 years or every 1 year or ever however often, this agency should update its definition, it should update its standards. The Supreme Court case, the Loper Bright decision, one of the things that fell out of that, one of the consequences, is it basically challenges the ability of agencies to do that definition work, to do that updating. And so in doing so, it doesn't guarantee it, right? It doesn't say that agencies can't do it, but it says they can be challenged in doing it, which creates this area of uncertainty that is maybe even worse. But one of the consequences, especially for tech policy, is that it means that there's now much more burden on the original legislators to not just pitch it over the fence and say, agency, you figure it out, you keep updating your definition, to think about, will the words that I write into law actually stand the test of time? And there are different camps on how to approach this, right? Some people would say, and I certainly, when we were working in Senator Wyden's team on the Algorithmic Accountability Act, we were thinking very specifically, how do we make something that is robust to potential future changes? But there are other people who say, you know what, we're going to just accept that the thing that we have right now is the thing that we have, and we know it's going to go old and stale, and we know that it's going to get outdated, but actually, because it's so narrowly scoped, we can get people to agree, and we can get people to put something forward because they know it will eventually expire. It actually can sometimes make it easier to get the political buy-in to do the thing. So there's this challenging situation, but the context in the U.S. is now legislators have to think a lot more about how they're actually defining stuff, because they can't necessarily count on agencies being able to do that work.
Yeah, which is different to a certain extent to how we function now with the EU AI Act and the AI Office that has to do a lot of the downstream thinking, and
Yes, which I
adaptation.
think I think is a very wise structure, right? It makes sense to have a dedicated entity that can do that deep expertise and development cultivation, um, because it's hard to get it all right in 20 words.
Well, I mean, in all fairness, the AI Act is 180 pages already, so it's not like we were very high level in terms of drafting on
To be
that one.
fair.
So I want to switch now to another side of what you do, which is super interesting, and that is public AI. You work on the public AI network, and you make a claim during that work that is more radical than it might first appear, which is that AI should be provisioned like public infrastructure, with the same expectations of universal access, democratic accountability, and public interest that we normally attach to roads, water, or libraries. And that to me looks like more than just a policy proposal. It's an argument about what kind of thing AI is, and as a result, what governance frameworks are appropriate. So looking at how revolutionary to a certain extent that is compared to the mainstream discussions on AI. Um, I imagine that you've received the counter argument that AI is not like roads or water, and that, because there's the need for innovation, etc., that's not something public institutions do. They're not good at it. How do you push back on the objections of people that think, AI is only for private companies because they're the only ones that can innovate?
Yeah, it's a great question, and this is something that I'm really passionate about. So there's two pieces to it, I would say. Um, One piece of it is let's just listen to what the AI companies say this technology is, right? They are claiming that it's this revolutionary information processing thing. It's this labor supplanting technology. It's this thing that's going to be so transformational. I think that like if we take them at their word, right? If we agree with that, then we recognize that the consequences of that are so substantial that it would be inexcusable to not have a public voice in that conversation. It would be if these things are as powerful and as transformative as people claim, then it is inexcusable for us to not have a democratic governance of these systems. So I think that on the one side, we can say, okay, well, there's this notion of where the need is. We need public input, we need governance, we need public accountability. On the other hand, I would also say that I kind of subscribe to the notion that like AI happens to be the latest cool thing we can do with electricity, and and we didn't stop innovating on electricity because it became a public utility. We've continued to innovate and do all of these fun things. And so I think that under that framing, it's also important for us to recognize that AI is made of many components. It is made of data systems. It is made of compute. It is made of a labor force. It is made of all of these different things. And so when we in the Public AI Network think about what it means to create public AI, we're thinking at every layer of the stack and asking, what would a more public version of this thing be? And I really espouse this idea. I know I'm based in Washington, D.C., and I'm very American in my situation here, but like there is this phrase in the US Constitution that I find incredibly powerful. And it is the phrase, in order to build a more perfect union. It is this notion that we are always striving toward this more perfect ideal of a thing. We're not saying in order to build a perfect union, we're saying in order to build a more perfect union, in order to aspire and strive. And so I take that same mentality to the work in public AI, where our goal is not to build necessarily the one single incarnation of the epitome of the platonic ideal of public AI, but rather it is to constantly strive for a more public incarnation of AI. And so I think that what that means in light of, people's concerns about, well, this is a fast changing space, and, we don't know what the future of AI will be. And there are all these commercial applications of these technologies, et cetera, is to say all true. And also we can always build a more public version of this thing. And so what that means to me in the space of thinking about public AI, and we subscribe to this notion that public AI isn't necessarily government AI. It's not necessarily, a public utility, although I think that is one version of these things that I really would like to see. But it is AI that is built in a way that is publicly accessible, meaning that people don't just have access to the endpoint of a chatbot or something like that, but that people can meaningfully engage with the tools of AI, the compute systems, the data, right? People can build their own systems. It is publicly accessible. It's publicly accountable, meaning that there are meaningful ways for people to engage in decision making about what these systems will or won't do. And it is also what we describe as like publicly sustainable, or it upholds permanent public goods, which means, it's not like a little research project that lives for 6 months and disappears, or a nonprofit that gets taken over by a corporate board, but instead is something that is built with this model of sustainability, like a public utility, that is able to continue to provide public goods. And so in that lens, I think that actually the world of libraries and roads and electricity is very apt, because these are systems that do support private innovation. We know that libraries and electricity and roads support all kinds of economic progress and development, and are used by private actors, but they are these fundamental core pieces of infrastructure that we also know need to be there, and you need to know that they're going to be there tomorrow, and we need to know that one company going out of business or one decision by some corporate leader isn't going to fundamentally disrupt that system. And so if we want to treat these technologies, if we want to take these AI developers at their word that these tools are the powerful transformational technologies that they are, then we need to make sure that they exist in a way that we can actually rely on and build on top of, which points to a public utility. And we also need to make sure that they have public governance, because if they're that impactful, we all deserve a voice in that system.
Looking at the public aspect, though, it is under a lot of pressure. I mean, I think from the US side, on the one hand, there was never any big intention to make it a public utility, certainly under the current government in the US. I mean, the US AI Action Plan is like, okay, we're throwing money at it. They can do whatever they want, not too many rules. I'm not talking state level, I mean federal level, obviously. But even in the EU, we are, the European Commission, the Parliament, they're all under pressure to, simplify, not too much regulation, allow, a lot of room for things to develop and for private entities to innovate. So looking at that and at how everyone is reacting maybe slightly differently, but still all in the same direction of, giving a lot of leeway to AI companies. Do you feel that there's any jurisdiction in the world right now that is getting the governance architecture roughly right? And if there isn't, what would it look like if to have a good, robust
Yeah,
governance architecture that serves,
I
the
think
public
that
good?
I think that no one has figured this out entirely, but there are meaningful experiments or examples underway. So, when we think about the public AI ecosystem, we're thinking about a bunch of different things. We're thinking about access, right? What does it mean to actually provide resources? So, obviously, there's the EU Gigafactories initiative. In the US, there is the National AI Research Resource Pilot. In some of the states, there's Empire AI, or the recently passed Cal Compute initiative. And so there's these spaces where people are beginning to think about what does it mean to provide greater access to the public, to public serving institutions, to our universities, to our civil society ecosystem. And so I do see some promising movement there. I also see in Switzerland and Spain, the Barcelona Supercomputing Center has been building ALIA, which is a model that is built in the Spanish language and Catalan, and these are examples of like Swiss AI has done a lot of work to negotiate the data that is provisioned for these systems to actually build in some of this like public accountability component into the work that they're doing. And so I think that we are seeing experiments like this. We are seeing pilots and leaders around the world of different examples of strategies that people can take. I think that I don't think that there is one way to get it right entirely. Like, I think that there are, depending on where in the stack you might be, right? We see a lot of conversations happening about, the minerals involved in building computer systems and the data centers that are getting built and all of these different parts of an AI system. And so I think that there's some really promising work going on. I even think that things like DSA and some of these kind of spaces of greater transparency and insight into the data in these systems is a step in the right direction. So I don't think that there's necessarily like any one jurisdiction that I can point to that's like, they have the comprehensive, perfect public AI, policy ecosystem, but also in the spirit of more public. I think that we don't yet know what is best. But I also think, and people love to say in the tech space, people love to say, oh, policy moves slowly and whatever, whatever. I think that we're experiencing a version of policy moving slowly right now, which is actually what the tech people want, which is right now we're experiencing a lag. So the policy ecosystem is still living in this, mindset of like, oh, we have to build, we have to, remove all the regulations, we have to whatever, right? That's like a lag. That's a holdover. Where the public is, where people are, where these next elections are going to come in, the people are not about AI right now. People are not excited about it. People are like quite mad about the data centers being built, about the way that these AI companies are acting. And I think that maybe it's true that the policy ecosystem is slow, but it's going to catch up eventually. And I think that we might actually see a dramatic swing in the other direction. And so I think that you're right in saying that, like, yes, as we look at this current landscape, um, it, it's looking like, wow, things are really kind of regressing when we're thinking about our regulatory environment. But I think that is temporary, and I think as some of the realities of the economic and cultural impacts of AI are felt, I think we're going to see a lot more energy on this front in particular.
Yeah, I imagine that at some point, as you said, because they have to react to the public, at some point that reaction will catch up. Um, Now, you mentioned before in when we talked about public AI, the importance of who participates in governing AI, and in different, I've seen you in different forums discussing about AI, etc. And you often point out that the people that are most affected by AI systems are rarely the people that are involved in shaping how those systems are defined, how they are regulated, how they are deployed, basically. Um, Looking at your approach, which is one of knowledge building, so basically empowering more people from different backgrounds to engage, possibly through shared language, and looking at how you, through this handbook, you're trying to give practical guidance to decision makers. Um, when you put a resource like this handbook in front of a legislative staffer or a regulator, what is the misconception that you're trying to correct, on their side, and what do you see as the most consistently recurring mistake in AI definitions from policymakers before they read the handbook? So basically, what's kind of the aha moment every time you enter an office where you go, I know that, I've heard that before, type of thing?
Yeah, I mean, I think a common misconception in this space, and I alluded to this earlier, is that there is one ultimate definition. There's a correct definition to be using. And so I think that one thing that this handbook illustrates is that there are many approaches, and that those approaches have a time and a place. And each word that you choose, each comma that you place, has implications. And so there's actually a lot of space and possibility to make impactful decisions through that definitional work. I think that one of the things that people often get wrong about defining AI is that they're motivated by responding to AI rather than responding to the issues or the opportunities that AI brings up. And so that's part of why in, for instance, the Algorithmic Accountability Act, when we were having all these conversations with people, people would often say, well, this covers a lot of stuff that's not AI, right? This covers all these other things. And there's actually a brilliant researcher who is one of the contributors to this handbook, Rashida Richardson, who talks about how any system, it doesn't have to use machine learning, any system that is being used to automate, to speed up and scale up certain decisions, and basically have this normative effect of deciding, who gets access, or who is decided to be guilty or innocent, or any of these systems that we use, even if they're incredibly rudimentary, even if we're just using a spreadsheet with a true false function in it, right? That has massive implications on people's lives. And so I think that one of the things that I hope that this work can do is to help unpack a little bit why AI brings so many things to the fore, why it makes us think about all these things. It's like such a potent imaginary as a technology, but at the same time to recognize that it's actually not necessarily distinct or unique in that capacity, and that there's actually other things that we should take into account. And so I'm a big believer in you know, creating policy around the outcome that we want to produce, the world we want to live in, and sometimes that means like taking inspiration from the challenges that AI might bring to top of mind, but it doesn't necessarily mean just focusing on that thing. In fact, the Algorithmic Accountability Act is very much about transparency in decision-making processes. Like that's what it's ultimately about. It happens to ride the zeitgeist and to be part of this, like, you know, oh, everybody's talking about AI, and that's a reality. Policymakers have to navigate that, right? But I think that one of the things that we can use a resource like this handbook to do is to reckon with what we are scoping in and out, and recognize that that maybe where the problem lives isn't necessarily in the machine learning model, right? And that means that we can use this moment to reflect on our broader systems, which frankly the status quo was not doing so hot before AI came on the scene anyways.
I would like to add to that. You mentioned that time lag between policy making and the reactions of the public, but is there also? I imagine there's also a gap between the people who understand the technology and the people who are writing the rules about the technology. And having worked at Senator Wyden's office, but also in your capacity at Aspen, your interactions with civil society, you mentioned that there was experts that helped in the handbook. Do you feel
Yeah.
that the gap is getting smaller or bigger?
Yeah, I think that it's complicated. My instinct is to say smaller. So there have been I got to participate. Ooh, I hit my mic. I got to participate as a Tech Congress Fellow, which is a program to bring technologists into Congress, as the name suggests. And there are a lot more programs like that around the world in parliaments, in judiciary systems. Increasingly people are like, wow, we need to have technologists at the table when we're making these decisions, and they need to work for us. They need to not just outsiders, they need to work for us. So I think in that respect there's been a tremendous upskilling of our policy apparatus. Like people are really recognizing that they need these skills, they need this expertise. And so we've seen a lot of hiring, a lot of work to build capacity. And last year I got to serve on the programming committee for the NeurIPS conference, which is the world's largest machine learning research conference. It's like 20 to 30,000 people. It's an incredible endeavor. And the NeurIPS conference has kind of risen to this place in the machine learning community as like this is like, this is the conference, this is the place, this is where big research happens, this is where big announcements are made. And I would say that there's been a shift, right? In the 2019 to 2020 time, maybe even into 2022, this like NeurIPS and the research community were really at the forefront of what is happening, and these kind of big AI companies were sharing their stuff, and they were using it as a place to like brag about what they're doing. What we've seen is, as this kind of like race narrative has been growing, of like, oh, is it going to be Anthropic, or is it going to be OpenAI, or is it going to, like, well, DeepSeek comes on the scene. There's all of these sort of competitive dynamics that are shifting us from a research frame of knowledge sharing toward a competitive and intellectual property frame of really like locking stuff down and not sharing things and keeping things private. And part of why that's also happening is because the cost of building these systems has become so astronomical that only a small number of players can participate in some of the types of research that are going on. And so in that respect, there's a lot more uncertainty in the air, right? As much as our policy institutions have really been getting up to speed and have been bringing all of this incredible expertise in-house, it is also the case that even for those working in these big AI companies, even for those who are in the field at the cutting edge, doing this work, people are like, what's going on? What's going to happen? What are they working on? People just, there's less information kind of floating around than there once was because people have begun to really, really kind of lock down their information flows. And so I think in that respect, it makes it challenging from a policy perspective because there are some developments that may be incredibly consequential. We've seen just in the last week, Anthropic saying that they're not going to release the kind of model and preview because of some of the cybersecurity implications, but there's not a lot of transparency into that. I think they're trying. They're putting out model cards and things like that. But like there's this world in which like the information available is just much more limited. And so I think that to me points to why we need public AI and why we need institutions that are doing this work in the open or with public oversight or in a democratic fashion, because part of being able to regulate well is understanding and really having a grasp on the technology. And so in some ways, like the best way you can regulate or legislate about a thing is to be doing it yourself and to know what it actually takes and know what it entails. So I'd love to see governments using that opportunity of building systems in the public interest as also an opportunity to inform their work on regulation.
That's actually a really good point to show the both sides of the coin. If public AI gets adopted, is you also get a knowledge that you do not have at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, one of the classic things that people say, like it's always the case that when there's some regulation that, companies don't like, they'll be like, that's too hard. That's really burdensome. And so like one of the best ways to be like, actually, no, is to just be like, well, we're doing it. It's totally fine. Uh, you kind of remove from the table some of the excuses.
I'm sure they're not making excuses. Come on. Um, so we're reaching the closing of the podcast, and I always ask the same two closing questions to all of my guests who, allow me afterwards to make a spreadsheet where I compare everyone. No, I'm not doing spreadsheets anymore. So the first question is, and you've talked about it already during the podcast, but if you had to summarize, what is the one thing decision makers, whether in business or government, most consistently misunderstand about AI right now?
I think the thing, and I maybe haven't spoken to this yet, but the thing that I'm really wish everyone working in this space could like feel in their bones is that this is not predetermined. The course of technology, the course of history has so much possibility in it. And I think that there's this narrative that has become so powerful as a meme, as this idea that we're just like, we're on this trajectory and we have to just accept that. And like the forces are too great and we can't change things. And like something that I think about in my life is that like only very recently, I want to say in the last decade or so, did we figure out how the Romans made their concrete. We had a technology. Humanity had a technology and we lost it for like hundreds, if not thousands of years. Like technologies, just because they exist today, may not, like, who knows? There could be a big solar flare and an EMP that knocks it. Like, we don't know. The possibility space is wide open. And so I think when people are thinking about technology, when they're thinking about these systems, it can just feel like, well, what can we do? There's nothing that we can really do or change about this. And I don't think that we need to be realistic about the course that we're on and how much momentum is behind it and how much inertia there is if we do want to shift course. But I also think that we should hold in our mind the reality that nothing is set in stone and that actually everything that is happening right now is happening because human beings are making decisions to allow or promote these things happening. And so, like, that can feel very disheartening and depressing because you could look at the world and the amount of suffering in it and be like, wow, I can't believe we chose this for ourselves. But on the other hand, I think it's incredibly liberating and inspiring to say, like, we can choose better. And so that's something that I feel really strongly about AI, especially in conversations about AI and labor. I think there's this notion that, like, AI necessarily has to be this labor substituting, this labor replacing, this job disrupting thing. And that is the trajectory we're on. That's that 100%. That's what people are trying to do right now. You know, people are defining their definition of success as performing all economically valuable work. Like, when that is your goal, yeah, that's the kind of tech you're going to build. But we can make new goals. We can do other things. And so I think that the one thing that I really want people to understand is that we can still make choices. Some of those choices will be difficult, but that doesn't mean that we should give up. And the arc of history is long, and so like, the possibility space is wide open, and it is worth us not just thinking about the bad futures we want to prevent, but actively striving toward the good ones we want to create.
I think it's Cory Doctorow who referred to the acronym TINA from Margaret Thatcher, which is "There is no alternative," which was her answer to everything when people were disagreeing with her.
It's a
So
toxic mindset, right? Like, we can't fall prey to the idea that there are no options. Like, that learned powerlessness is one of the most dangerous things that humans can experience.
Um, so the second question is, if you could change one thing about how the public conversation about AI is conducted, what would it be?
Yeah. I think so. Something that I'm working on right now, our team at the Aspen Institute is working a lot on something that we call community aligned AI benchmarks. And the idea behind this is really the idea that the public should not just be exercising accountability in AI systems in terms of saying the things we don't want to happen, or saying, like, this kind of harm is bad. But really, accountability also means building the things the public desires, making the world that we want possible. And there's a notion in the AI space that a lot of researchers subscribe to, which is just like, we just need to build more intelligent systems, whatever the intelligence is defined as. That's a whole other definition project. And there's this idea that the only way to bring about progress is to build these kind of general purpose systems that, who knows what they're going to be used for, but I'm sure they'll be used for really great things. And I want to challenge that notion. And I think that the way I want the public conversation around AI to take place is for us to really take that step back to say, like, the course is not set. What do we want to be striving toward? Not just what do we want to avoid, but what do we want to strive toward? And specifically, what is it going to take for us to get there? I think that it's easy to say, oh, we want to address climate change. We want this age of human flourishing. We want all these good things. But I think that we also have to really, like, get down into the details and say, like, who's going to help us figure out specifically what needs to be done. And actually, when I was very early in my kind of AI policy career, I wrote this piece for Partnership on AI about kind of like what we could still do back then when the community was small, while we still could use peer pressure to change the space. And one of the things I was concerned about was, let's pretend that like we build the AI gods, right? Like, let's pretend that happens, and these powerful, super intelligent AI systems come back to us, and they're like, what you really need to do is reduce the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Like, what you really need, like, it may be that we already know that, like, are we even going to listen? Even if we had some super intelligent system, will we even do what needs to be done? And so I think that we don't want to wait until then. We don't need to wait. You don't need to have super intelligent AI in order to see some of the things that very immediately need addressing, like world hunger, like climate change. There are all these issues, housing, the cost of living. There's so many things that we know are pressing issues. I challenge the public to bring that fight to AI developers, because I actually think a lot of people working in this space do want to do good in the world. Like, I actually think there are a lot of good people in these organizations, and so I think that it is incumbent on us as a public